I kissed the last guest goodbye at 7 a.m., realizing that we did in fact get to celebrate it 3 times. But Kirill and I had exchanged contact that night really briefly. It was kind of like, I see you, you look cool, let's exchange social media. And then we dispersed. But maybe Kirill, you could say like what you were doing in Helsinki at the time, because you weren't living there.
Yeah, it's actually kind of like an interesting story. I was traveling, like I have this kind of tradition with my family that every New Year we go to a different place in a different country. And that year I was traveling with my family and some family friends to the north of Finland and to Helsinki for the New Year. So I actually like the only person I knew in Helsinki on that day was Helen, who actually introduced me to Vanessa and kindly invited me to her home celebration. And yeah, so it was just an interesting encounter, totally unexpected, but also very interesting. And I'm so glad we met. That was like uh, it's unexpected, but turned out to be a great experience.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't know anything about each other's work, so it's kind of interesting that it all came together with this circumstance, that it just really fit together like a puzzle, actually.
So how did you think of reaching out to each other?
Well, I received your invitation to participate in the magazine, and thinking about this idea of bubbles was something that I had been working on with this text, How to Avoid Getting the Bends. And that piece had been published. Originally, it kind of started from the dissertation that I had been writing at the time, which was very much focusing on curating online and practices of using the internet and what it would mean to imbue the fundamental idea of curating back into digital platforms. So there was a bit of text that I had written then that just didn't seem to quite fit. And I had taken it out and expanded it and wanted to focus on this idea of like moving too quickly with technology and how we're getting overwhelmed and inundated with it and everything that we do, and wanting to feel comfortable with that, but also feel mindful at all times. So this text was kind of born from that, and it was originally published in Is This It?, which is another platform curated by Bob Nickel-Knight. He does these online residencies and also does publications. And something that I'm very interested in is reworking texts for specific contexts. So the text was actually later published in another amazing series of publications called Clog. They're based in Brooklyn, and they take kind of bigger ideas and invite many contributors who are working in visual arts, have writing practices, etc., to come and think together on the topic in more kind of extended format. So they've done publications on ideas like the Guggenheim or prisons or guns. And so they invited me to submit that text for an issue that they were doing on artificial intelligence. But the way that they edited that piece was like heavily redacted. I needed to meet like a 500 word limit, which meant like I sliced up so much of the creative language that I felt was crucial to the text. So being invited to kind of represent the work in the context of Precog, that was not only the physical publication, but the digital one as well, felt like another way for me to bring life to that piece, because the piece is short, but it takes on this really big metaphor of what it means to like be a deep sea diver, essentially, and like going underwater, doing this kind of like deep sea excursion and going so deep that you don't recognize where you are, but then realizing that you need to get to the surface. So a lot of my practice curatorially and as an artist has in recent years focused on digital platforms and how we utilize them in our day-to-day. And while I'm using that as a metaphor, what I'm actually looking at is, I think, what it means to be a curator and artist in general. using the tools that we have at hand. But while I've written a lot on those things, I don't have a lot of hands-on experience with working in them. So I might have written about a VR or AI, but that technology felt really unavailable to me. So it just felt kind of seamless, and I reached out to my online community when I was offered the chance to participate in Precog, and was like, does anybody know how to do this? Would anyone be interested in like working together on making this happen? And Kirill was like, yeah, I'm curious. And so we kind of opened a conversation, and it really kind of spiraled pretty organically after that.
Great. And maybe we can look at a little clip.
Yeah, I was just going to show them the rest of the collaboration in the magazine, and then we can.
Yeah, and the theme of the issue was bubbles. So we reached out to a group of artists and writers, and with the prompt of what is a bubble, both in a physical form, but also metaphorical form, how, you know, we are in bubbles in our online communities, how we break the bubbles, how we join. So all these different artists and writers like reinterpreted the theme of the bubble. And then we transferred this idea. We asked them also to imagine what it would be like to, I don't know, create something for a virtual space. So we collaborated with Nick Steindorf and John Baptiste that have been working on the Virtual Dream Center, which is, I guess, a collaborative curatorial practice where they invite artists to come in and also collaborate with them on a different format, which is like a virtual experience.
And Nick is here today, so that's cool.
Yeah, and maybe John Baptiste.
Yeah, and maybe. Okay, so I'm gonna press play on this one. This is just what it's like to interact with the game. And this is Vanessa and Kirill's piece.
As each software update continues to promise an even greater level of cognition and connectivity than the last, the fine print fails to disclose disconnection as one of many possible side effects. As each software update continues to promise an even greater level of cognition and connectivity than the last.
I think that's this section, but I can go back into it if you guys want. And this is available to download for free you can get to it through precogmagazine.xyz, but it's also on the Virtual Dream Center's website, which is virtualdreamcenter.xyz, and the game is downloadable, and you can see the entirety of Vanessa and Kirill's piece there. And a lot
so can you talk a little bit about how this environment of ice and water and the idea of reflection came about?
Yeah, I think it definitely speaks to the circumstances in which we're immediately available to us in thinking about the way this collaboration came to be, even just having met in Finland. I mean, this had been my environment visually for the last few years. It was very isolated, very icy. I was thinking about this, like the idea of ice floes being spaces of connection as well as like spaces of disconnection at the same time. But something that was also an idea that kept coming through in the text was this idea of water, of course. I mean, water and bubbles are recurring elements in that piece. But also, I bring up this idea of a kind of like tundra almost that's uninhabitable. And I'm using the text to kind of project into a future where things have been so outsourced that they don't exist anymore. And that for me meant this kind of almost barren wasteland. And it was like, if we look ahead and if we continue to move this quickly, one of the things I touch upon is this idea of accelerationism, which is essentially exacerbating capitalism to the point where everything kind of meets this fiery end, and then potentially we get this opportunity to start over. But that for me just kind of takes us into a world where there's nothing left and it's quite void, but somebody's always paying the price. So when Kirill and I started talking, I mean, it since evolved, but I think the environment just grew a lot colder as we kept bouncing ideas back and forth.
And where did the statue, what are the things that are in the environment? Because there's really like, you have to travel to see it, and then where did this come from?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was actually really fascinated by some of the terminology that Vanessa used in the text. Like some words were almost like hashtags that I wanted to transform into certain objects. Like there were like really strong terms like utopian halo, bottomless purpose, the deep sea of darkness, and very powerful descriptions like addiction that swallows first-time users. And I especially like a new world order that might emerge like a phoenix from techno ash. I think that terminology, it really gave me a certain perception of the environment. And then reading like the text of that Vanessa referred to, like Accelerationism Manifesto for Accelerationism Politics, was an interesting experience. And I kept, while working on this environment, I kept thinking about like this quote by Slavoj Žižek, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of the capitalism. I think this is kind of like part of the framework that is very present in the work. Even though I wasn't necessarily trying to imagine the end of capitalism, but I think this whole idea of like a cold environment reflecting like artificial intelligence or super artificial intelligence, where the bubble is this main bubble in the environment is representing like the post-human knowledge, or like the non-human knowledge of artificial intelligence. And this ice, for example, is for me a kind of metaphor for muddy waters that Vanessa also referred to in her text, like being able to see the surface level of things, but not being able to look down. And also like a lot of reflections that are present are this something that relates a lot to looking back at like accelerationism, like post-humanity, like looking back at itself through technology and such.
Yeah, I wanted to also speak a little bit about some of the more formal elements that you find in the environment. So the character that you come across, I think, is one of the most perfect embodiments of what you were talking about, Kirill, just looking at both the end of the world and the end of capitalism. So the figure that you're seeing there is kind of depicted in this virtual space that is opposite of green or like habitable for humanity. There's no vegetation, there's no trees. It feels like the air would be really cold and almost toxic in a way. And yet you see this like white male businessman. And in the end of the environment, he's essentially like floating and kind of drowning. And while he's a character who's not necessarily named verbatim in my text, it's kind of the person that I'm referring to. So when I speak about this idea of outsourced responsibility in the sense of, relying on something like accelerationism, that's the person who's outsourcing the responsibility. And so therefore they've been placed inside of this environment as kind of the person who is then left to kind of reconfigure everything and be sitting in this techno ash smog that's left behind from all of the destruction. What you see in that environment also are these like wind turbines that kind of symbolize alternative energy sources, but there's like no wind in there turning them. There's also a sound component, and that sound is actually made from another source of inspiration from bubbles. And I pieced together all of these sound files from dolphins that were using echolocation. So they're like slowed down and kind of almost cynical if you listen closely. It's kind of like end of the world dolphins, apocalypse dolphins. But they're also like that sound for me, and that act of echolocating is kind of maybe what that character is doing within that space, like seeking out to find something or someone that might, share any kind of humanness, which just you can tell that in this environment simply doesn't exist, not even in animal form.
And I wanted to ask you, so how have your ideas changed now? Because I feel like what you were writing about before was the process of slowing down and how it was impossible. And now we are forced to slow down. And also, all these animals are coming out. So can you talk about how you feel now that things are slowed down?
I feel incredibly slow. This is the second Zoom meeting I've done in like however long we've been in quarantine, and I've been really kind of fighting it off just because, we kind of touched on this idea of like performativity, and it's really draining and exhausting. So like if anybody needs to take a nap right now, like no hard feelings, totally get it. But it's insane. Like I feel as though I've been reduced to just kind of like one activity a day. I'm not able to be productive, but I'm also in the space of what this kind of is referred to as guilt-free non-productivity. There's a great lecture by Sarat Maharaji that I'm happy to share with anybody who's interested about artistic research. And I'm definitely in that phase where I'm trying not to feel bad about it and just letting it sink in and recognizing that distraction is also attention, and reminding myself that that's okay right now. But in a lot of ways, I feel like the dissertation that I had done several years ago about curating online, in a way, has mentally prepared me for this, and being able to slow down and not have this sense of immense FOMO. Like I'm okay. I'm not going to see everything, and I probably shouldn't even try. That seems insane.
Could you talk a little bit more about that, Vanessa? Like, in what way did just sketching out the idea of your dissertation, sort of what it was and how it was that it kind of prepared you for this particular moment?
Yeah, I think a lot of my dissertation really focused on the way that news cycles are continuously refreshed, and I'm sure we all know that very well. Every 15 minutes I search New York City coronavirus update, and the New York Times, like, I'm sure has gained many subscribers recently. But a lot of what my dissertation was focusing on was
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. I think we lost
Frozen.
Oh,
do
we lost you for a minute.
We lost you.
my back?
Yeah, you're back.
Did you lose me at the New York Times?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm talking about news cycles in general, and the way that we're just kind of accustomed to this like constant refreshing system, and we're just waiting for the new now constantly. So what I was trying to focus on in that writing was thinking about the way that we can take this idea of now and expand it so that it's not constantly just now, what's the new, what's the now, but how can we actually imbue mindfulness not as the kind of more neoliberal structure where like, oh my God, you realize I'm overwhelmed and now I need this $15.99 a month app called mindfulness or calm or something because I've reached my max capacity. But rather, how can we incorporate slowness or critical thinking into all of the things that we're doing, especially in places where that becomes increasingly difficult to do because the platforms that we are utilizing and are given access to make that so difficult for us to see or access or be in conversation with. They purposefully try to keep us away from that. But I think that takes time, it takes research, but luckily we have that right now.
Well, I wanted to ask you about the text you wrote about snakes.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about the snake as this creature that's always shedding and it's always turning into a new thing, but it's, you know, and how technology is like a snake that is constantly changing. And I wanted to ask you if you think that technology is a living organism, and if it is a living organism and it's attached to us, can we ever be free of technology? Like, can we ever go offline and survive anymore, you know?
Yeah, short answer, no. To take a step back, that text that Flo is referring to is called Watch On for Snakes. It's on the landing page of my website if anyone wants to take a read. That text I wrote a few years ago, and I feel like every time I try to take it off my website, I like read it again, and then I'm like, no, you should stay there. And it's like, it reminds me constantly what my relationship is to even my own website or being online in general. Essentially, the text uses this metaphor, this age-old metaphor of the snake to describe my relationship with the internet. So something that I find aesthetically very fascinating. It's an interesting creature, but it also has this, it has the symbolism that's inherent within it. It's been utilized for ages, but there's also an element of danger. So I explore all of those things similarly with my relationship online. And the text is called Watch On for Snakes, not Watch Out for Snakes. And that's kind of a point that I stress because I think that something that comes through in this text is that once you log on, there's no option to log off anymore. You know, that kind of becomes an impossible gesture. So what do you do despite that? And I think that's always the question that I have in whatever text I'm writing, is like, what do we do despite that? And that again kind of takes me back to some of the other texts in this work, is like, where can collectivity come into play? Where can slowness come into play? Where can mindfulness come into play? If these are the platforms that we are deciding to use, like, how can we better cater them to our own usage? If we know that technology is essentially an extension of ourselves, because of course it is, whether or not we see that, there's always a person behind that. You know, there is a physical being controlling the algorithm. And so I think that level of mindfulness can help us recognize that it's not this impenetrable fortress that we might perceive it to be, but it does have a human scale.
And then I have a question for you, Kirill, because you work a lot with other artists, musicians, designers, and you've been working on these virtual environments, right? And how far away do you think we are from having VR be accessible to everyone?
That's a very good question. Well, you know, I was recently thinking because of all this situation, of course, it would make sense to give everyone like an opportunity to have VR glasses or experience VR environments. Although unfortunately, that's not really the case. Like, I am a student of graphic design in the Gerrit Rietveld Academy in Amsterdam, and we don't really have that technology available to students or to teachers at all. Like, you know, that it would be amazing if it was more accessible, but I mean, during this time, you would think that virtual exhibitions and virtual platforms would become a more recurring thing. And I think they're definitely becoming more common. I've been getting like requests from different people to for collaborations, and for some people were asking me about the possibilities of digitalization of their platforms and exhibition environments. I think on the internet definitely like there is it's not the kind of virtual reality that we want. It's more like a 360-degree like experience.
Like,
Or
are they trying to just recreate what it's like to go to a gallery?
yeah, I would say more or less.
Financial thing, like, are they thinking that they're gonna be able to sell something? And yeah.
Yeah. I think that's I think that might be like one of the problems with thinking about virtual reality, because for at least for me, virtual reality is a medium of its own. It's like it's a whole different space. It's not something that you can just take and transfer your physical gallery or like a physical work to. It's something that requires a different level of understanding and thinking. And what I noticed a lot with my friends and some other platforms that I was looking into is that a lot of people now are just thinking about this virtual reality as another form, like Instagram, for example, that you can just have as an extension of your social platform or something. And I think that's a misunderstanding of the medium. It definitely has potential to become a new form of expression. And yeah, I think we should start thinking about it as such.
Kirill, I was also wondering if the way that if you have I'm sure you do, but if you have a relationship to the way that Vanessa was talking about space and time, and the way that speeds in speculative environments, whether they're digital or virtual, like how you're thinking about speed, compression, and a sense of the present tense, if that's something that you think about in your work and how you build out these spaces.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Sure. So Vanessa was talking about the way that, and maybe if I'm paraphrasing you badly, Vanessa, just jump in here. But the way that the internet creates this kind of present, which in some ways has like appears to us as sort of beyond our reach, right? It's like you always have other things to do, like it's infinitely flat, but also infinitely deep. And that like learning how to engage with slowness inside of this kind of immediate demand is sort of required, right? Because the way that space and time operate within this digital platform is just really different than the way it happens in the material world as we experience it. And I was just wondering if and what, maybe those aren't the right prepositions, but like how you're thinking about space or time inside of virtual platforms, and maybe the opportunities that virtual reality has for expanding our concepts of the temporal and speed, maybe.
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting question, or it feels a little bit more like a statement also. But I think, in a way, I work a lot with virtual reality. I work a lot with virtual platforms, and for me, at least when I start working inside of the VR glasses, it feels like a completely different level of reality. And I guess it also like relates kind of to accelerationism and this, it feels like a different timeline. It's in a way you don't feel the time in the same way. It's almost like this sense of time is just, it's also like related a lot, I think, to this concept of like you can always kind of like look outside and see what time of day it is, or like there is this physical perception of time, like your body feels like more tired towards a certain like in relation to your rhythm and the time of the day. But in VR, you don't really have that kind of option. Like what the developers usually do is that they try to like imitate the sky, and it kind of like changes with the time of the day, or like you can adjust it in your own way. But if that element is not present, then it's really hard to tell like how the perception of time is completely different. And what I noticed with myself as well is that I can spend hours in VR, and it almost feels like I've just been missing for like a few, like 10 minutes or something. But of course it's this difference of perception in the virtual world comparing to the physical world. When you come back to the physical reality, you feel really tired, and you feel like you actually spend all that time, but in your mind it's not the same, because for you it might have been like much less than it actually was in the real time.
I think that's something that we also thought about in our environment. So if you look at the kind of sense of time that we put into that space, it's like perpetual sunset. So the day is always setting, but a new one never comes. And it's just kind of that feeling of waiting that I think we were trying to bring out before things get too dark. But that moment of sunset happens so quickly in real life that you have like this window of maybe 10 minutes, and then it's kind of gone, and it's so fleeting. This just kind of was on.
Talk about ephemerality, because you've also written about Eva Hesse, or your project At the Speed of Resin, and how her work is all about the material in that moment before the material solidifies, and that working time, and it's very physical, and then you're writing about all these like online ever-changing experiences. So can you talk a little bit more about that project?
Yeah, that's a great connection. That's a project that I was working on around the same time of my dissertation. So I had been living in Finland, but I had started a project in New York in 2018, or in the end of 2017, and an exhibition opened January 2nd, 2018. I was invited to curate an exhibition in a space called Dispersed Holdings, which was a kind of reading and listening library space located on the Bowery, run by Sal Randolph and David Richardson. And when they had moved into that space, they actually didn't know that it was Eva Hesse's old house and her old studio, which was kind of an amazing discovery. For those of you who don't know, Eva Hesse is an amazing artist who was kind of working in the 60s and 70s before she passed away fairly prematurely. She was in her early 30s. She was an artist who was working with materials that were sort of, we didn't know how dangerous they were at the time, and the kind of protective equipment that we should be wearing, like fiberglass and resin and things like that. But I was invited to curate an exhibition there as one of the last things that was happening in that space before Dispersed Holdings eventually dispersed. So having been kind of operating between the spaces of Finland and New York, I wanted to do an exhibition that was kind of using both of those spaces as starting points, but also points of disintegration. So I worked with 19 women identifying artists who identified as working in either of those spaces, but kind of speaking to the fact that they were coming from so many other places in the world. And the exhibition focused on this idea of collaboration. While I was working in Eva's home, you would be able to look outside and across the street and see Tom Doyle's house, which was her husband at the time. They had a fairly tumultuous relationship. And while I was working in that space, actually, that building that Tom had lived in was being demolished by a company called Always First Demolition. So that took the exhibition title. And a lot of the work that came into that space was about very much so about responding to the space. There was an artist who she was a Japanese artist, but living in Russia. She was mailing things every day to the gallery for a month before the show, but nothing made it until like one piece made it on the day of the show. We had an artist who was really inspired by the color red that was kind of in operation in that space. And she had collected materials from the neighborhood, and she had knit a braid that went around the entire perimeter of the space, which we then later buried underneath a floorboard before moving out. There were a lot of ephemeral kind of aspects that went into that space. One artist, Michelle Hernandez Vega, she did a piece where she was painting with black light, and we had actually planned what she was going to do. She was going to draw a door in black light in this particular space. And then when we finally met in it, we actually realized that there had been a door there in the past and it had been sealed up. But anyway, a lot of amazing collaborations came to be. There was a performance, and we recently put out a book. I don't know how well you'll be able to see this, but so just to kind of give you an idea, this show, because it felt like such an experience, it was almost like, I mean, you just kind of had to be there. You had to be there. And we wanted to keep that in, not try to resist that feeling, and just kind of understand that that's the case for everything. And that like this idea of pure documentation is simply kind of a fallacy. And kind of to speak to what Kirill was saying about VR, it's that it's its own unique experience. It's not ever going to emulate and be something else. So why can't we just embrace that and let it be what it is? So when we were putting together the documentation for this book, what we did is like each work was kind of photographed in its own kind of ephemeral way. We used disposable cameras, we used whatever we kind of had available. And there are signatures in the book. So you'll see like one image from somebody's artwork kind of butting up against somebody else's, and the signatures eventually line up. Let's see. So this is like not a full spread, it's two different images, but, and then like these two artworks are in conversation. See if we can find a signature. So like this is one full image, but then on this side and then to the back, you would get works that are kind of starting new collaboration. So kind of continuing that conversation. And there was also an essay written for that that really speaks to this idea of recycling and not feeling as though we need to constantly feel under the pressure of making something new. We need to kind of take the time to digest and sit with and understand what it is we're actually building on top of.
And how do you feel about collaboration now in this kind of circumstance? Because you were like thinking about making some kind of space in your home, right?
Yeah. This is one of the first real collaborations that I've done. And with Kirill, it felt like we just kind of really trusted each other. And it felt really amazing to kind of see the insight that he brought into the work that I just couldn't envision. I mean, I couldn't see it in the same way that he did. So it's incredible to kind of see that come together. But in terms of this space that you're referring to now, I've been, before quarantine and everything happened, I've been thinking about different ways to kind of come together. And I've always been interested in DIY and kind of more alternative spaces and also the domestic space. But behind this wall where I'm sitting, we have a small room that's been kind of used as our yoga and meditation space. And I've been thinking about ways to kind of turn that into an exhibition space, and was thinking about working with artists who kind of center ideas of health and wellness in their practice, and using this as an opportunity to bring physical works in, but to also make it more of an experience about sharing space together, which, you know, at the time when I was conceiving of this still felt very important, but now feels almost urgently so, although I can't imagine how we would all behave now in such close quarters. But of course, that project has been put on hold. And what has happened in the space is that there is also a window there. So while I can't bring people in, what I have been doing is broadcasting out. So you're able to see a poem that I've put in vinyl, and you can see that from the floor, from the ground level on the street. So if anyone's in Bed-Stuy and wants to walk by and see a poem, just let me know. I'll send you my text, and I'll toss you a snack from the window.
And I just had one more question before we get to everyone else can start sending questions into the chat. But Kirill, I wanted to ask you about your collaboration, the Deity project, because I was thinking about, you know, everyone, we have to think about health a lot every day now. And with that project, you are looking at, you know, what it means to log data, your genetic data into, you know, who owns this data. And I'm thinking about how, you know, now with coronavirus, they need this information from survivors in order to find a cure. And so that means that there's like this conflict between, you know, what is this information going to be used for, but we also need to give, you know, our information in order to heal everyone, right? So can you talk a little bit about how this project has been evolving?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, this project started out actually not long ago before the whole quarantine situation. So I met Eden, who is an Israeli-born fashion designer and a futurist, through a common friends of ours, and he approached me with this idea of working on a project about the future of DNA editing. So our project is focused on consequences of DNA editing on the people kind, and we want to explore what the future ethics of our society will be like. How what will be the consequences of editing DNA? How we will perceive ourselves as what is the word, as species, and I think in relation to like this current situation, it's just showing like that this topic is even more relevant than we realized, because in a situation like this, of course, like you said, it's you know, it's the topic of privacy becomes very important, and usually like what we hear and see in this crisis situation is that privacy gets violated by certain people, corporations, or governments, or it kind of forces the governments to create new regulations for privacy. So basically, every time a crisis situation like that arises, we face a new sort of reality with like, how do we treat our data? Is our data is the data that we have our own, or is it property of someone else? Can it be accessed by other people? What are the ethical questions of like sharing data? You know, so I think that's really
We always give away our data for free. So do you think like that would change? Like maybe people would start paying for, you know, genetic data?
I think, well, you know, I think that's certainly like one of the possibilities. The point of so what we're going to do is I'm actually going to develop a virtual environment through which people will be able to experience and face difficult ethical questions related to DNA editing and future of people kind. And yeah, we want to basically give people a possibility to decide and face those decisions on their own. But in relation to your question, I think like there are so many different possibilities of how the DNA data might be used by governments or corporations. Like I think what we're looking into is I think the future that we're looking on is um, kind of more or less a dystopian one, actually. And thinking about how corporations like Facebook use our data as a raw material, I think it makes sense to conclude that we would not have as much control over our DNA as we might want to.
Yeah. Well, also like 23andMe, like every time you take an ancestry test, they own your data and they can sell it. Yeah.
Guilty. I paid them to take my data.
Yeah, but it might be good for you in the future. So does anyone have any questions for Vanessa and Kirill?
So far, it's a little bit quiet, but
Yeah, come on, like you all know each other. Like,
and I was gonna ask Vanessa and Kirill if you have questions for each other, like that you wanted to, I don't know, performatively ask or something, given the Zoom meeting of it all.
The Zoom performance question.
Exactly.
I have a question for Kirill. Do you feel like this way of collaborating offered you like a different insight into your own practice? Like, is there something that you feel that you're taking away from this that you might not have otherwise been able to access?
Yeah, definitely. I think this collaboration has been a very rich experience, and I've also learned a lot. I mean, reading your text was a very interesting experience indeed, and I mean, not as just as a reference for the work, but I think it uncovered a whole new kind of direction of work that or like direction of interest that I started working on in the future projects, and also like reflecting on the collaboration. I think it's been most exciting to just kind of work in this format of like sending data and feedback back and forth and discussing this over distance. I think it's yeah, it's been very exciting for sure.
Yeah, I think it's been really informative. For those who may have tuned in a little bit late, Kirill's calling in from Amsterdam. So we've been kind of talking over time zone differences and just different head spaces and like calling in day and night and catching each other in different moments. And I think there's also been a lot of time in between our collaboration. So I'm sure that has also been informed by our own personal experience. And like, I think we've also checked in and just been like, I'm sorry, I'm like not in the headspace to do this right now. Or like, I think our first call, you might have been in an airport or something.
Oh yeah, oh my God.
Yeah. Remember airports, everybody?
well, also
Yeah.
a lot of your work has to do with wandering, and now you can't travel. It's hard to imagine traveling again, right? And
yeah, I mean, I think that's something that the work, I mean, being also in the entire context of the Bubble Orchestra virtual kind of reality space, like that exploration feels so encouraged right now, and a safe kind of space to explore when our outside world isn't offering us that at the current moment.
So Kara has a question, which is, if you had to spend the rest of your life in a VR environment, what would it be like?
Oh my God. Wow. Didn't expect that. I tend to think about VR as a kind of new level to reality. So I think if I would have to spend my life in VR, that would be like a kind of environment where I would have possible or imaginable tools available to create my own reality. I think that's that's for me, that's also what VR is about. You sort of construct your own world, and well, I think I would be glad to like live in my own world that I construct.
So
Is
you
that
making it as you go.
Animal Crossing?
What's that?
That Animal Crossing game?
What's that?
Oh, it's this game, or that's Animal Crossing? I'm like looking at Michael, where you like have your island and you can build things on it, and
Are there actually
you don't need money, but you can get money.
Okay, cool. I pick that.
Yeah.
If I actually had to think about a virtual reality space that I could spend it in, I mean, I can't even really imagine those things, which is why I collaborated with Kirill. Putting myself in that space feels almost just like indulgent in a way, where like if I had 3 wishes, I would just wish for what I had around me, except I wish outside and other people weren't seen as toxic right now. I really miss that.
Another question. Are you done? Sorry, I don't want to cut you off.
Yeah.
Okay. So Heidi wanted to know, given the conversation we were having about the problem of digital surveillance and mining digital data, what is the solution besides stepping away from the table, so like total withdrawal, or depending on elected officials, or using art to call attention? Like, is there an actual response to this that's or
Yeah, I mean, something that I bring up in the text is that our response to this can't be total withdrawal, because that's exactly how we would get the bends. We're already in too deep, and coming back up to the surface would, make our blood burst. So this idea of like total withdrawal is not an option. And then we all know how things work with our elected officials. It's slow, if at all. Circumstances are dire in the U.S. at the moment. But I think something to really prioritize is collective action. And I know that that's not a blanket solution, but when that becomes our reality, I think that it is possible to affect change. And I mean, platforms like this that really snowball and kind of allow people to gain access to information that they didn't otherwise have. I've always kind of been a proponent of change happening on a one-to-one level. Like a collaboration like this feels like maybe the best example of that, where I've been exposed and learned something about something I thought maybe I had known about, but it had been revealed to me all of the other aspects and components of it that I now feel much more confident with and understanding of, to be able to imbue into my own daily life and to my practice and to the spaces of mindfulness and attention. Like, where is my attention going now? It's able to be redirected into other spaces because of the knowledge that I've gained. So I do think that while it might not be an immediate solution or might not have immediate results, I do think that coming together in ways like this, for example, are one of our answers.
Gary? Where did she go? Well, I don't know where she is, but I guess my question is, so what's your normal day like moving forward from now, like from now on? Yeah.
Well, in New York, they've extended our kind of shutdown for another month, which is like on one end unthinkable, but also duh. I think kind of we were talking in the beginning that like, even if they kind of opened up the city tomorrow, like who in their right mind would even go outside? I'm afraid of the outdoors. I'm afraid of people. I don't know how to socialize. Day to day, I am in my apartment. Sometimes I do a yoga class. and then I just like waste time on the internet. So if you guys have any suggestions for like where to waste time, please send me an email. Like it could be a 5-minute video, something that like made you laugh or smile. No context necessary. You don't need to explain yourself, but send it my way.
Okay. What about you, Kirill?
Oh, moderator's muted.
Okay, sorry about that. I was like, there was a commotion in my living room for a minute. Okay.
Well, I feel like things have been pretty different to like comparing to other places over here in the Netherlands. I have been able to go out, outside of my house, that is, all this time. And it seems like also the government is not really willing to shut down the country, even though that was an option. So day to day, I'm just adapting as much as I can. And I mean, most of my practice is digital, and I think actually like this whole self-quarantine situation is helping a lot in connecting me with other people, because we have kind of like the same base structure for scheduling our routine, and it's easier to work with someone who won't be going out anytime soon. So in that sense, I mean, I don't know, it's kind of sad and funny maybe in a sense, but I feel like I've adapted fairly well. I'm going outside for bicycle rides. For those that don't know, the Netherlands has a really great cycling infrastructure. Basically, you can go out anywhere and cycle to like any place. And I live sort of on the edge of the city, so I don't get to see like any people at all, which is great.
I have 2 more questions. The first is from Randy, who wants to know if either of you have book suggestions.
Ooh, yeah. I wish I was zooming in from the library downstairs. But if you're interested in this kind of topic that we have been discussing today, I brought 2 things that were really kind of formative in writing a lot of these texts. The first one is Infinite Distraction by Dominic Petman, which kind of talks about exactly what we've been discussing today about this idea of paying attention to social media, like which we all are doing. I'm sure we're all infinitely scrolling forever and ever. But what can that scroll be? I think that's one of the questions that comes up here a lot. It's a quick read, big font, really, really great. And then another text which I refer back to is You Are Here, Art After the Internet, with a lot of short essays by some amazing artists and scholars that touch upon this idea of the internet as a more physical space. And I think that's something that is important for us to remember as we do continue to get lost in the scroll.
I would actually I think, well, for me personally, it's in this situation, it's a little bit hard to read, or I find it myself very distracted. So instead of recommending books, I would suggest watching anime called Serial Experiments Lane. I don't know if any of you heard of that, but it's a great cyberpunk classic that explores kind of question of connectivity to internet and this kind of living online as a way to exist, and this like interconnection futurist sort of world where we all will be connected in ways that are hard to imagine now. So that's one, and another one maybe also Ghost in the Shell, as in the original cyberpunk series from I think 1995. That's for those who haven't seen it yet. I definitely recommend watching it. Very futuristic Tokyo, like Japanese futurism fashion, and I mean, just a great watch, also like entertaining, and explores questions of privacy and cybernetics, and yeah, just a lot of interesting things, I think.
Cool. Can you repeat the name of the first one?
So it's called Serial Experiments Lane.
Lane, like a place you walk?
Oh yeah, I will send it to the chat.
Okay.
Great. And I think there is a withdrawn question, but I'll send that to everyone. And I think for now, that's it. So thank you so much, Kirill and Vanessa. I'm going to unmute everyone for late game chaos. But thank you to everyone for coming. And thank you both again for doing this with us. And everyone is now unmuted. Cool. Bye.
For having us.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for hosting this, guys. It was really nice.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for coming on. And it's really nice to, I don't think we'd met Kirill in person yet. So it's really nice to get to meet you.
Wait, I was gonna ask, so now the Facebook isn't approving any more face filters still?
Actually they are. I just saw a recent update. They're starting to approve them again. So yeah, it would be nice to have a chat, maybe sometime next week.
How's your schedule? Do you feel like you have a lot of work still?
Well, I love these like
I'm like, sorry, if you don't want to hear, you can go.
Close Zoom now. Close
And
interview.
everyone
Actually, Vanessa, I wanted to ask you, because sorry, like it's a bit late now, but if you still feel like, I feel like the question that you asked me was great. I just wanted to send it back to you. Like, how do you feel?
I feel illuminated in a lot of ways, and I've been using that word accidentally. Like I keep meaning to say I've been enlightened, but I said illuminated sometime last week, and I actually kind of really liked it. I do feel like a light bulb kind of turned on. Words. I mean, of course, when I'm writing, I have some kind of vision of like what it is I see, but I think being able to kind of extrapolate that and have it be registered and read and understood and then reformatted through somebody else's eyes helps me not only look at my own writing and critique it in a way to see it like almost like asking yourself, like, is it working? Like, is what I'm trying to do working? And how effective is it? And is it working in the way that I want it to? So I think that was something that was really interesting, and being able to like just kind of like share something and understand like the way that things can be reflected back. Like even if the text felt like a finished piece and I wasn't going back and editing it, I think like as I kind of mentioned, I really do enjoy working in this way where I don't mind republishing a piece, and that I'm curious like what the next iteration of that will be, because the next iteration happens after this collaboration, meaning that it's already taken on a new form and
Levian? Are you Levan? Is that the designer you work with, or no? The person you're working on the DNA project didn't show up, right?
Oh, sorry, you were
asking. What is the name of the person you're collaborating on the DNA? The designer that you're doing the DNA project with?
Oh, it's Eden Grady.
Okay.
Yeah, he couldn't be here today, unfortunately.
Oh, that's cool.
Is Vanessa actually here? I can't see her.
You got kicked off.
Yeah,
Her internet might have died.
or I think her internet or her device may have.
How is everyone else in this chat doing?
You guys okay?
You can talk.
I guess I was like really interested in like the overlap between, or like Kirill, your interest in fashion and like almost like utopianism, like the aesthetics of sci-fi and kind of how you're influenced by that and how like fashion or aesthetics can like form a new way of like thinking in the world. So I don't know, it's not really a question, but
Oops.
I have thoughts about that.
Oh, Vanessa back.
Quick break, had to go to virtual reality. Sorry, I don't know where I cut off, but I'm sure we've moved on.
Yeah.
Do you want me to say something about like, do you want me to comment on the what you mentioned?
I guess like your relationship to fashion
Mhm.
and sci-fi.
Interesting question. My relation to fashion, I don't know if I have a direct relation to fashion. I think fashion is well, this project that we're working on now with Eden is a great way for me to connect to fashion because in my practice I don't normally do projects that are related to materials, like physical materials that are wearable or that are a part of the body in some way. So he,
Oops, sorry.
because it's a collaborative project as well, he is working on a collection that we were going to present on London Fashion Week, but unfortunately it got cancelled. But we're still going to present this collection together with the virtual experience. So for me, like looking at him working with fashion is kind of like on another physical level of understanding of like reflection of my work. And for him, I guess, looking at my work is the same thing. So we get like mutual inspiration from working virtually and physically. I think that's an interesting dynamic.
Carlos?
Oh, everyone can unmute themselves now, but having everyone unmuted at once apparently was a little bit too much chaos. But yeah.
Carlos?
Yeah.
What are you doing? Now he's frozen.
Oh no.
Oh,
My studio.
In the studio?
I'm not particularly doing anything, just working for survival on money right now. So.
Oh, okay. So what does that mean?
What with the tough questions today?
Doing some design work and delivering some assets and some other random stuff. Yeah. So nothing that interesting really. Basically, and I have a thing tree over here on the back there. So every 3 days, I have to come back to the studio and try to keep it alive because I'm gonna feel really guilty if it dies.
If it dies? Yeah. Isn't it like so horrible when like a plant dies? You feel really responsible.
Yes, definitely.
And you have a swing.
I kind of put those plants through a lot of stuff. Oh yeah, I have my meditation there. Reading.
This is getting stuck.
And I just can't have a hammock because then I take naps all day. So I needed to have a midpoint between a chair and a hammock. So
That's good. Does anyone have a good meditation to share, or Vanessa?
You want like a guided meditation?
Yeah, what is your favorite one? I'm collecting them.
Oh,
You
hold on.
know, I didn't. What's that?
I think Levon, is that how you say your name? I'm gonna unmute you. Okay, there you go.
Yeah, I just started. Hi, everyone. This is really amazing. Thanks for having me here. Yeah, I just sent the link of guided hypnosis and meditation, which
Okay,
I've been
cool.
doing very intensely. And like, I'm generally not the person who gets focused that easily. I was sure that I would never be able to do meditation, but I'm doing that for 3-4 hours. So like, yeah, I mean, it's magical. Yeah.
Okay.
Wow. I'm going to follow that lead because I was just about to publicly come out and say I don't meditate.
I never. That was something I was
I know
sure.
that we talked about the meditation room.
Yeah, I would never do that. Yeah. Yeah,
But-
that was beyond my capacity.
Yeah, no, it's not for me. And don't even try to start. I've done the retreats. I've practiced yoga for years. Like, it's been there.
Yeah.
It's not for me. So if Levon says he's got one,
Yeah, I sent you. Yeah.
I believe you and I trust you.
Thank you.
I bet Alana might have one too. Do you do the meditation or do you just do I know you do a lot of yoga, Bill.
Yeah, I do a lot of yoga. I have lots of virtual yoga people I could recommend. I don't do a lot of meditation without doing yoga, but this is one that's probably not going to be relevant to most people. But most of my relationship to meditation now is birth related because I'm a birth doula. So I have done birth meditations, even though I've never given birth, to try them before recommending them to my clients. So there's a meditation app called Expectful that I've recommended to clients that is intended for expecting parents, but I also use it for myself, and it like helps you fall asleep, and it's very relaxing. So if you're interested in a guided meditation that's also going to talk to you about the baby that you may or may not be growing in your body.
Stressful.
Mostly what I know about.
I think we're all kind of expectant parents right now. Like, we're all very responsible for the birthing of whatever reality is next. So we could all use a minute to just reflect on what our social responsibility is.
Yeah, there you go. So
Yeah.
right now I'm working on hypnobirthing. But that is all really about, like, it's guided meditations and visualizations for relaxation, and practice sort of breathing through discomfort and relaxing your body through discomfort. So it's something that I guess my relationship to meditation now, I often practice it through that lens of thinking about it as how would this work in the context of preparation for birth.
Does it work now that can you go to the hospital? You can't, right? Do you just get on the phone and you're like telling the meditation like?
Yeah. So it's case by case with all of my clients. With some people, I'm laboring with them at home before they go to the hospital. Some clients have transferred to home birth or to a birth center. The Brooklyn Birth Center is still allowing doulas. In fact, they, for the most part, require them for most of their clients. And then I have one client who's a single parent, so I would be her one support person that's allowed in the hospital with her. So far, I am providing in-person support to everyone that I'm working with, or I'm planning to. But if for some of my clients, like once they go to the hospital, or for the ones at the birth center, like if they transfer, I would have to provide virtual support. So it feels crazy to me, but like what most doulas are doing now is virtual supports through phone and video chat and things like this. It's challenging. It's a whole new like challenging medium of like how to do that sort of thing virtually. But yeah, it's an interesting learning experience.
And do you think like mothers are more stressed out than usual or not really?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
They're more scared.
Yeah, people are terrified. It's really challenging. It's a really challenging time to be giving birth. Yeah, they're much more anxious than usual and extremely isolated. You know, I have a client who gave birth right before all this happened, who I saw the other day. She lives in my neighborhood, and she's a single parent, and she had lined up a whole support system to help her after the baby was born, and that all disappeared because of social distancing. So she's completely isolated and on her own. Yeah, there's been I mean, for people that are interested, like the New York Times had a really interesting article just today, and they've had a few, but there was one today that I read about a single parents. This was about a single parent who just gave birth in Queens near me. Very similar story to my client, but a different person, and sort of how pregnant and birthing people are being impacted right now. Unrelated to this talk, sorry.
No, but it's
all related,
reality, right? Like,
I think this is also like a sort of a futuristic kind of thing that we don't have the tools for yet. But I did like a project a few years ago about perception of the body in the virtual reality. I think this is a very like a topic that's very what's the word? Sorry, completely forgot the word, but it's very important now. So yeah, I just keep thinking like, what would the world look like after, you know, this apocalypse ends? Like, would we invent like machines that would transmit our like gestures through distance? Like if we are in VR, can we interact with other people? Would we have like a sort of virtual body? Would our perception extend to other places through the means of technology? I think these are questions that are raised on the rise kind of now.
That's really, so since you brought that up, that's something that in your question, I didn't think about, but for people who have been having to give birth alone, I have heard some doulas talk about, and actually the doula I trained with, about, you know, what would it be like to give that person virtual reality goggles to be able to visualize having her partner there with her at the birth? And so that's something that has come up in the birth community, which is really.
But then you wouldn't be in the moment, right? Of having this birth, because you're like looking at your partner, or.
Well, I mean, in some ways you don't want to be. Like, that is a helpful strategy. That can be a helpful strategy as well, you know. I mean, especially if you're in a scary hospital environment, like that's not an environment that's conducive to birth.
So, Alana, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So you were talking about what is essentially like telemedicine for doulas, right? Like, so you're talking about being able to help from a distance, you know, provide this care without the proximity of your two bodies, like allowing for it really. And I know that a lot of what you do doesn't seem to have a lot of communication. Like, I know a lot of doulas and a lot of people in your community, like they pay attention to medicine, right? But the converse doesn't always seem to be true. Is there any like interaction between like what you're seeing with people working on what we think of like conventional for-profit telemedicine, like the kind we need for, you know, the virology stuff and the patient care, going on in the same conversations as you guys are having about kind of your form of telemedicine? Does it feel segmented?
What do you mean? Do I see people in conventional medicine
having similar conversations as you are in your community, in the doula community, trying to figure out how best to approach this kind of care?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, I can't speak. I'm not in the conventional medical community, so I don't know totally what conversations they're having. But I can speak to some of the webinars I've attended that were put on by obstetricians and midwives, for example, that do work within the hospital system. And I think some are trying. I think on the one hand, the conventional medical system is threatened by video because of the legal implications. And so there definitely have been hospitals that are not comfortable with virtual doula support or even virtual partner support because they typically ban video of any kind, even if you're not recording, because they're worried about liability and HIPAA. And then on the other hand, I think one thing, so for midwives, for example, and obstetricians that are predominantly conducting their visits now through telemedicine, one thing that's interesting is they're having to sort of get really creative with training their patients to be able to perform medical tasks that they would normally do in the office. So like sending them blood pressure cuffs, sending them kits to be able to test their own urine and test their own blood, because they're not going into the office to get basic labs done. I don't think this is encouraged yet, but one of the questions that comes up is, listening to the baby's heart rate. How can you do that virtually in a safe way? And so I think those conversations are happening in terms of how to conduct tests and sort of maintain required medical visits and things to protect people's safety virtually.
Those conversations are happening within your circles, right?
They're definitely happening within the birth community circle.
Yeah, I just wonder because I see, so much difference between the approach, the holistic approach versus the for-profit model. And right away when all this started happening, people immediately started going, all right, telemedicine, make it happen. And it seems like there's this conversion problem now where like, how do we do this? And it seems it's like the people who were developing food and milk for restaurants have to dump it out because they can't convert to that market to get it to you, because these places have closed. And I wonder if the for-profit model for medicine is kind of having the same effect, whereas you guys seem to be kind of moving pretty quickly, getting it happening, whereas from what I've seen with the promise of telemedicine for more traditional medicine, Western medicine, it's having a bit more of a setback. So that's interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak as much to what's happening outside my community because I'm not in that and I'm not following it as much. But I think within the birth community, it's including for doctors in the birth community, it's out of necessity. It's happening immediately because people are having babies now. Birth is something you can't stop because of a pandemic. It's going to keep going. So we have to figure out these sort of immediate solutions in the moment and in a state of crisis.
It potentially become an even bigger issue in about 9 months or so, depending on how long we're all quarantined and with who.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I was talking to someone recently who said that anthropologists have shown that while we do see a surge in births 9 months after a blackout or I don't know, a blackout is the example that comes to mind, or hurricane
war.
But
it's not like war.
No, but exactly that, like during times of war or a pandemic or any time where there are mass fatalities, it has the opposite effect. I guess because it's sort of
probably also in a time when we're scared of other people.
Right.
No.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
Okay,
Yeah.
guys, I have to leave. Thanks for this.
Bye.
Bye.
But I think just to like kind of connect what you were both kind of touching upon, this idea between the maybe more individual or nonprofit sector versus the institutionalized for-profit capitalist driven market, I think in regards to arts and culture also applies. I mean, how are individuals tackling exactly what we're experiencing and prioritizing our individual well-being versus whatever larger institutions are doing? Like, let's look at larger museums, for example. Like, what is the Whitney doing? What is MoMA doing? What is the Met doing? They've laid off 75% of their employees. Whereas, you know, I see individuals coming together and saying, all right, I just received my $1,200 stimulus check. Like, is anyone selling work? Like, how can I direct deposit this into communities that would just immediately impact low-income communities, migrant communities, artist communities, etc. And I think that that's something that we need to be paying attention to at the same time as we're being distracted right now. Full circle, just to bring it full circle.
Yeah, it's true.
It reminds me of sort of what some of y'all, I mean, you know, the conversation around like not even, it's like the art world as a market, or like the art market is so it's like so unprepared or like dumb about digital technology that like I mean, we were talking about this and complaining, you know, that like the people, it's like immediately the first move was to say like which galleries are moving their shows online, and not like what is the world of digital art that has existed for 20 years that
And
now we can
show
as digital
like
art.
the lamest like set like interactive tour, or like not even like it's just like some photos of what's happening in an empty museum, or like also
Who cares?
right.
Sorry. Do you think these are all examples of them kind of just falling back on what they've already spent 2 decades establishing as their digital model? Like they've already put time and money into people, right? Like developing like
Have a digital model.
galleries?
No one, like no, museums, galleries, it's very basic. Like just having some images online isn't a digital anything, you know?
Well, that's what I'm saying is I think that's what they think their digital
They're all like,
realm is. I think their website for some of these people is like, oh yeah, we're online. You're talking about people who are in like their 60s and 70s and like who are going like, oh yeah, that's fine. Yeah, we're on the internet. Let them go on the internet.
the beginning, I think, is that they already like didn't think about all this like people, all the artists that are making work, and they haven't been including them in programming, so they're never going to have access to what's really going on, because it's like they're so disconnected from what's really artists are making, you know?
I think Flo touches on a really important word, which is access. I mean, what have physical exhibitions been made to cater to? Physical bodies, because that's been what's been most available to them. And so they're not going to cater to the minority, which might be the person who is not able to leave their home or to experience that world without some kind of assistance. And so many institutions haven't invested in those platforms. Therefore, they haven't spent any time researching or developing them. And frankly, this won't be the time.
Yeah.
This isn't the time that people are going to be spending investing in that. They're going to, I think people are more concerned with their immediate well-being and the I guess, kind of hope of thinking of like, maybe next month we'll be back to normal.
Well, a lot of galleries are trying to do that, you know, like thinking that they're, you know, if they call enough that they're gonna sell something.
Well, I think the other thing too, and something which is really interesting about both of your thinking and work, Vanessa and Kirill, as representative, is that like, of course, like just because something is virtual doesn't mean it doesn't have a materiality, right? And it doesn't have its own kind of physical dimension. And that like trying to treat the internet as something which can simulate a physical experience like is just spectacle, right? As opposed to like using the virtual parameters, which might in some ways be speculative or spectacular, but like doesn't at this point, probably because people don't know how to use it, right? Not that you couldn't like turn it into like advertising hell, but like right now that's not what it is, right? It's a kind of different open sort of space that has its own physical contours and parameters.
I mean, you're also, I think you're also touching upon the accessibility of this technology, because I mean, it's not like we all have access to high-end like computers that can run VR environments or whatever. And it's not, I mean, even though we hear about like Apple like developing, you know, virtual reality compatible with their devices, I think we're still like a bit behind on the accessibility of this technology. I mean, it would be nice if it was accessible to everyone, but I mean, just thinking about like institutions, like for example, museums, like how if they would to create virtual exhibitions, how can they share it with other people if they don't have the access to this technology of the virtual reality? Or like, because I mean, on the internet, of course, you can transform museum into a digital space or a digital kind of environment, but it's not going to be the same kind of physical interactive reality that can replace the real thing. I think this is an interesting dynamic also.
I think this is something that this text of how to avoid getting the bends really touches on. I mean, somebody will always be left behind. This idea of accelerationism really applies to us, for example, those in the United States, where we're considered a first world country and are kind of pioneering in a lot of technological realms. But we're able to do that because we're outsourcing our responsibility. We need to think about the physical ramifications of what it means for us to move forward while somebody else gets left behind.
That reminded me, as he was speaking, I was thinking about like, what would access to VR for everyone look like? What would a VR setup in every home mean, right? What would that take?
I think it would mean we could quarantine forever.
No, but how would we get there, right? Who's gonna make this one, right? Is it the artists of the world? Is it the bad guys of the world who are gonna put VR in every home? Like, what is that going to mean? What are the implications of VR in every home, of access to VR for everybody?
It's going to come in our microwaves.
You just get like Google glasses and then you put your phone in there.
Yeah. I think this should like thinking about that. It's like who's you know, what Oculus, I don't know if you heard of Oculus, but it's like one of the 3 biggest companies that makes VR glasses now. What they're trying to do is actually like they're owned by Facebook. So they were purchased like a few years back. And now because Facebook has actually their own like kind of section on the website for Oculus. And I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to bring this technology and make it accessible. I myself have a VR headset from Oculus, and it's you know, it's much more affordable than any other products similar on the market. And I think this is you know, like they're connecting so the way also it works is that if you purchase such a set of glasses, then you have to use your Facebook account to actually start using those glasses. And I think it's you know, it's similar also to what they're doing in Africa, as like providing internet for people, but then they have to use Facebook. So like you're kind of stuck with that provider of the technology that forces you to like, that mines your data, that like you know, gives
it's
your
also censored, I imagine, right?
What was that?
That they can censor the information you share.
I think he's talking also more about the data mining, right? The rights you're giving away by participating in this thing.
But like in different countries, in order to even be allowed to like have your technology in the country, you have to agree to certain rules. So like in China, they have like no Animal Crossing, for example, because like everyone was protesting in this game and they had to outlaw about the game.
I was too new to the conversation before you mentioned it, but I did just start playing Animal Crossing for the first time as a person that's not 20 years old.
And now you're obsessed.
You know, quarantining with it, I haven't owned a video game system in like over a decade, and I will say that I have allowed myself to get a little invested in it.
I mean, what else are you gonna do?
It'll end quickly. This is how I am. I'll get bored of it and I'll never touch it again.
Let's be real though, who's gonna make VR accessible to the people?
Well, that's what I was gonna say. It's like,
who's gonna profit?
And to sell things, right? To sell us more things, or
yes, I'm at like Amazon and Whole Foods. Now you can. Quarantine would be the perfect time to launch it. You can like go to the grocery store. You can go to the club. Going out with our friends.
Go to the grocery store. That's so sad.
Like in VR and just like
in VR, but it's
a
the experience at the same time.
Isn't Amazon and Whole Foods not actually pivoting very well to this though?
I just read that Jeff Bezos just profited $24 billion.
Yeah,
and now he's profiting, but nobody else who works for other people.
None of them
are profiting.
He's making a lot of money, but like, where's the food distribution, right? So like in New York, where it's like I should be able to deliver anytime, no one I know can get a time slot. It's not happening. It's this. They weren't built for this. Just like the farms weren't built for this. That's like they had to dump their shit. Right, like none of it along the lines are built for this. So people are like in New Jersey, restaurants are selling groceries. Mm-hmm. They're doing farmers markets in their parking lot with what they would normally get from the farm. They're just pivoting. These small businesses can just pivot on a fucking dime if they want to. But these big companies, they can't do that. That's not how it works. It takes 30 meetings in 3 years, you know, to make a decision for a lot of these.
Maybe they can get things done faster if it's all Zoom meetings.
Right.
I mean,
I'm just wondering if we're talking about VR in every home, right? Who's now in charge of VR at every home, or is it decentralized? Like along that path, someone's going to have to be fighting that DRM fight, right? That was happening 20 years ago. Someone's going to have to be fighting that fight to keep it decentralized, or there's going to be like an Amazon of VR, right? And they'll be in charge of all your data. Yeah. So I just think that's
you know, that's an interesting thing to think about. I think also like in relation to what's been going on in the VR world for the past like maybe 2-3 years. It's like, I mean, as I've mentioned before, Facebook came to the market and they kind of like took everyone else who was producing VR before. They did like a cheap version of VR that was more accessible. I mean, VR is still like a big privilege, you know. It's not like everybody can afford like an expensive set or computer to run this technology on. And then, I mean, all the VR content is actually very expensive as well. It's much more expensive than the normal content that you would buy on your, I don't know, PC or Mac. So in that sense, like, you know, you can think of VR as a kind of like new technology that just arriving, and then you would pay like for the, you know, like you're paying for your phone. Now you're committing to like a certain brand, like Apple, I don't know, Google or whatever. And I think what we're seeing is also like those brands, like, I don't know if Amazon like actually started experimenting with VR yet, but I think at some point they're gonna jump on the train and just start selling their own VR headsets. And I think what we'll see in the future is this kind of system of interconnected, like sort of internet of VR, where you would buy certain headset from a brand to which you like, you know, it's kind of like
Netflix VR versus HBO VR.
Yeah, it's exactly that. Like what's the term? Like kind of identity politics of VR is like who you trust most, you know, like is it Google, is it Amazon, is it Facebook, like what, like, you know, choosing from the best.
But also, where are all the hackers that like doing like hacking important things? Well, like,
are they?
They're always doing that.
But why isn't anyone like doing something useful right now?
Everyone's really tired.
They're all like, I can't.
Yeah.
But they like love to Zoom bomb. They have a lot of time.
Zoom bombs and Ring. Ring is the big one for a little bit now. You guys know about Ring?
Wait, hold
Oh
on.
yeah, the surveillance thing, right? They're like hacking
They
it.
love hacking them because they're
They're
easy.
really easy.
Oh, the
They're easy to hack, and they love getting in there and freaking people out.
I wouldn't mind the like kind of distraction a little bit.
It's all that's kind of that edge of like the hacker gamer weird world is like kind of fun in games, right? That's not they want to play pranks on you. Granted, they are often very hateful, disgusting pranks with a lot of awful language, but they're not the ones like scamming your credit cards and shit. That's like a whole different realm of like hackers, I think.
Yeah.
I just watched Hackers last night.
The 90s movie?
Yeah.
Oh,
I can
wow.
tell you so much about that movie. My friend played it in the park a couple years ago, and she's like, I forgot about it. I'm like, how could you forget about this movie?
It's
That's
so
the best movie in
good.
the entire world.
But I was also gonna say, like, I remember getting the New York Times like a year ago, and in there was like a cardboard cutout of a VR system that everyone who got the newspaper could get. You just like unfolded it and like stuck your phone in. So I mean, it's like that's kind of an accessible way, but like I was also wondering about like, you know, is there, I don't really know much about like making a VR world, but is there like a Photoshop for VR, like something that is accessible to people, like a platform, not like Netflix where you consume it, but like where you can make it?
I feel like that's Nick. Nick is gone now, but that's
Nick was
Jean-Baptiste.
I mean, I can also answer that, and like
Yeah.
as a person who works with VR. Yeah, there are definitely like there isn't like a Photoshop of VR yet, but there are other tools that are just completely amazing to use, like sculpting and drawing and creating like it's a whole direction of like visual storytelling. But unfortunately, since VR is such a privileged technology, I think it's very inaccessible to people. Like I would bring an example, but since we already like since it's already maybe late, but I did like a work last year for a Russian musician, Kirill Zakomoldin. For her, I developed like a whole set of environments in virtual reality, which I later transformed into different forms like videos. And then one of the ways to like show it, because I mean, I know that VR is not like really an option for, it's not like a silent disco where you can just put your headphones on. So what I did is I contacted one of the venues that she was playing. She was having a concert in, and they set up a whole like, it's kind of like a dome. So they had like a 360-degree view of the like interconnected screens, and I was able to like connect my visuals and broadcast them on the screen. So it was kind of like another version of virtual reality, but not like really virtual. It's more like a 360-degree like view of the virtual reality. So I think in that sense, it's like interesting how you can create and then bring that creations in the different mediums that show like parts of the environment in what like multi-dimensional way.
Yeah, totally. Like, I'm just remembering a really shitty job I had where I was given a 3D camera and I basically had to walk into businesses without telling them that I was doing this and stick it on my head and like document inside the business. And like,
How did you find this job? Is this a Craigslist job? It feels like a Craigslist job.
yeah, it's one of the many things.
like walking around.
That camera was so cool though, and I feel like there's like a lot of potential. Like I doubt the camera was very expensive.
It was a GoPro, wasn't it?
Yeah, it wasn't a GoPro. It
It wasn't even 360. It was just
yeah,
like
ball
Randy's view.
in the top of the camera. Like, worst job ever.
So,
But
sorry.
Oh.
I think so. You might have been talking about like a 360 camera, right?
What's that?
Like a 360 camera, like one of the early ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think so. For me, I don't know anybody here. I work in film, video, pretty basic. For me, my attitude towards virtual reality in the day to day is one of like deference. I don't really. It's like 3D for my medium. It's not meaningful for what they do. You know, Lars von Trier in VR is a mess. I'll never see it. It will be stupid. There's no reason to move past the flat medium. Whereas I think there's all this stuff you can do in VR that the first things that people always go to are like the very simple ones, like how can we put a movie in VR? How can we put a game in VR? Right? How can we use VR for this thing we already make money doing? Whereas
pornography, like I feel like aren't they?
Pornography was like the very first thing to get good. Like they were like, all right, we got this figured out. We have it in under a month. It's all, you know, it's seamless, ready to go. We can bill. You know, they were ready to go. But for like the longer implications, like it's not something that lends itself, I think, to a lot of what we think of as traditional media, because traditional media is inherently different than our experience, right? It has to. We have that translation period. And so when we're in VR, that translation period gets very smaller. And that's the thing I think that people are going to have to play with and figure out. That I'm excited to see what happens in the future for that.
I feel like Pornhub would be like the best people to like develop this technology.
They're already
get so much
ahead of you.
We don't even know.
You don't even know.
I feel like they'd find a way to make it into a trafficking situation. So I don't know if that's the best
but
way to go with those people.
They're ahead of the game. I mean, that's such a massive industry that could benefit so heavily from that. That has, like you said, is already paid for.
Yeah.
Yeah. Up and running.
We'll have to wait and see what the future holds.
Okay, everyone, I think it's time to go eat dinner.
Yeah.
Hungry, Flo?
Yeah. I'm sorry. We've talked, and I know it's late because everyone's in different parts of the world, right? But we're gonna do this again next Thursday with an artist from China. Can you say her name, Gabby?
Effie Xiaofu Wang, or her name is Xiaofu Wang, but she goes by Effie as well, and she's in Shanghai. And I know her from a couple of different things in New York, and she's a rad painter, also in Bubble Orchestra.
Yeah, she made a video too.
Yeah, but she also we wanted to talk to her because, like, obviously things have gone down already there, and they're in the process of reopening quarantine. So she's kind of like 2 months ahead of where we are or something.
Or maybe more. We don't know.
Into the future.
Into the future. But she's great, and she's going to be joining us at what is effectively 6 a.m. her time. So, so come back next week. The meeting ID will be different, and it's always on the Instagram and emails. And we have to like do a better job of building out our mailing list, I guess, but we'll get on that.
Also, it's like hard for people to commit to anything. So I feel like we had a good group.
Yeah, it's true.
I think it also depends because, like, I know a lot of my friends are with work and stuff. They're on Zoom all day, so the last thing they want to do is get on another group chat. So I think, yeah, it's difficult. Designers, they're just like no more.
But thank you all for coming virtually. Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you, Kirill. Thank you for answering all the questions.
Thank you for having us.
Be safe, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Take
See you
care.
guys in the real touchable world.
Yeah, in the barbecue where you bring the beans, you know.
Bring the
Bye.
Bye.
at the barbecue.